The first scream was so faint that the villagers of Pingfang thought it was the cry of an animal wounded in the fields. A thin, breaking noise carried by the wind across the frozen plains of Manchuria, easily dismissed, quickly forgotten. But the second scream, that one sounded unmistakably human. It slid across the night like a knife dipped in ice, long and trembling, as though torn from the throat of someone trapped far beneath the earth. Those who heard it paused, hands freezing in midair, breaths caught in their chests. And then came the silence. A terrible, swallowing silence that felt far more frightening than the noise. Welcome, viewer. Before we step deeper into this story, one of the darkest and most unsettling chapters in human history, take a moment to prepare yourself. What you're about to hear is not fiction, not a ghost tale whispered around a campfire. These events happened, witnessed by thousands, erased by governments, and remembered only by the few who survived. If you appreciate this kind of deep historical storytelling, consider subscribing. Your support helps ensure that more hidden histories come to light. And now, if you're ready, let us descend into the shadows of Unit 731. If this introduction grips you, subscribe for more. The villagers did not know it yet, but the screams marked the dawn of a nightmare. A new presence had arrived, quietly, steadily, and with a hunger that seemed to swallow both the land and the people. The Japanese occupation had already weighed heavily on Manchuria, but what was being built on the outskirts of Pingfang was different, darker than any military post, colder than any fortress. It began with land surveys, men in black uniforms driving stakes into the soil, followed by construction crews who spoke little and worked in silence even when the winter winds howled. Soon, long stretches of barbed wire appeared like metal vines strangling the earth, and guard towers rose where corn once grew. The villagers stared from a distance, clutching their coats and children closer. At first, no one dared ask questions. Questions during wartime were dangerous, and answers were even worse. But the rumors spread quietly through the market stalls and around smoky hearths. Some said the facility was a prison. Others said it was a research station for new medicines. A few whispered that it was a slaughterhouse. No one knew the truth, and those who speculated too loudly found themselves visited by soldiers who warned them to keep their mouths shut and their heads low. The trains were what truly frightened the villagers. They arrived late at night, their whistles muted, their engines crawling like wounded beasts. They carried no cargo that anyone could see, no boxes stacked on the platforms, no livestock. Instead, the trains smelled of sweat, fear, and something else, something metallic. Soldiers unloaded people in the dead of night, pushing them forward with rifle butts, marching them through the gates and into the shadows. They were never seen again. Men, women, sometimes even children, their faces hollow with hunger and terror, stumbling into the unknown. Soon the villagers gave the trains a name: the death trains. Even the birds avoided the tracks. Children were warned not to look, not even from afar. Grandparents closed their windows whenever the distant rumble echoed across the fields. Dogs howled whenever the train lamps swept across the village roofs. Night after night, the trains arrived, and each time the air grew colder, as though the approaching facility was leaching warmth from the land itself. One winter morning, a layer of ash drifted over the village like gray snow. At first,
The villagers thought it was a strange weather pattern, but when they stepped outside and brushed the flakes between their fingers, they knew it was something else. It smelled faintly of burnt paper, mixed with something that made their stomachs twist. No one said a word, but everyone looked toward the facility's smokestacks. Flames rose from them day and night, and the air shimmered with heat that felt unnatural in the freezing season. Inside the village, a man named Li Chang began to keep notes. He was not a scholar or a rebel, just a farmer with a curious mind and a growing fear. He marked the dates of train arrivals, the days when ash fell, the times when soldiers knocked on doors. He recorded disappearing neighbors, families taken from their beds, accused of aiding resistance, or simply vanishing without explanation. He recorded the unnatural quiet that hung over Pingfang like a blanket stuffed with cotton and nightmares. His final entry would be found years later, charred around the edges, stained with something unidentifiable. It read only, "Something evil has taken root here." The villagers noticed that even the seasons behaved strangely around the facility. The winds seemed to change direction abruptly whenever they blew from the compound. Snow melted faster near the drainage dishes, where murky water trickled out, carrying foam and strange colors. Crops closest to the fence withered without reason, turning yellow and brittle long before harvest. Animals avoided the area. Horses reared when forced to pass near the gates. Chickens laid fewer eggs. A cow collapsed suddenly during grazing, its eyes rolling back as if seeing something no human ever could. The village doctor had no explanation, only fear. And through all this, the screams continued. Not every night, not always loud, but often enough to haunt dreams. Sometimes they were short and sharp, like someone shocked by cold water. Other times they were long, drawn-out cries that rose and fell in waves, as though someone was being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The villagers reported feeling sick on nights when the screams were particularly intense. Headaches, nausea, trembling hands. As if the air itself carried the pain outward, poisoning everything it touched. One night, a young boy named June heard a scream unlike any before. It began high, then broke suddenly into a guttural sound that sent him bolting upright in his bed. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the noise felt like it was inside him, vibrating through his bones. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt alive, pulsating with the residue of suffering. The next morning, soldiers were seen dragging a cart covered with a tarp toward the crematory building inside the facility. The tarp sagged strangely in certain places, as though something underneath it had been twisted out of natural shape. The villagers began locking their doors earlier each night. They taught their children to pray silently. Some families attempted to flee to nearby towns, but those caught by patrols never returned. Fear had become a shadow that stretched across the land, long and cold and impossible to outrun. The facility continued to grow. More buildings, more fences, more guards. A logo appeared on the main gate, a simple, clean emblem that gave no clue of the horrors inside. Trucks rumbled through the gates, leaving behind tire tracks stained with a dark, sticky residue that rain could not wash away. The villagers who ventured near found dead insects scattered near the fences in unnatural clusters. And then came the day when the villagers saw a man inside the facility staring down at them from one of the towers. His uniform was pristine, his posture rigid, his eyes sharp and clinical. He watched them with the detached interest of a scientist observing insects in a jar. His presence sent chills through the village like a sudden winter storm. His name was Ishii Shiro, and although the villagers did not know it, they had just witnessed the arrival of one of the most malevolent figures in modern history. A man whose obsession with biological warfare was matched only by his willingness to sacrifice thousands of innocent lives in pursuit of data. Behind those cold eyes lay a mind that saw human beings not as people, but as instruments, tools to be dissected, measured, infected, and discarded. The villagers felt the shift immediately. It was as if the land itself recoiled from his presence. More soldiers appeared, more screams followed. The death trains doubled in number, and the ash, thicker now, fell more frequently, staining the snow in shades of gray and black. Pingfang had become a place where daylight did not warm the ground, where nightfall brought dread instead of rest, where every breath tasted faintly of smoke and sorrow. Something monstrous had awakened behind those walls, and soon the world would learn its name, Unit 731. Before Unit 731 became the vast empire of suffering that would swallow Pingfang whole, before its furnaces burned day and night, before its laboratories filled with the stench of rot and disease, there was only a single man with an ambition so cold and vast that it eclipsed every shred of humanity left within him. His name drifted through the Japanese scientific community long before his boots ever touched Manchurian soil. Spoken with admiration by some, unease by others, and fear by the rare few who sensed the darkness gathering in his wake. Ishii Shiro did not look like a monster at first glance. He was a man shaped by precision, his uniform immaculate, his steps measured, his hair always neatly groomed. His eyes, however, betrayed something deeper. They were sharp, not with intelligence alone, but with an unsettling hunger. A hunger for discovery that did not distinguish between animal and man, between theory and cruelty, between the pursuit of knowledge and the annihilation of ethics. Those who met him described a mind that moved rapidly, leaping from hypothesis to hypothesis with the restless energy of a predator stalking prey. To understand how he rose to power, one must look back to his early years in Tokyo. Japan was a nation caught between tradition and modernity, racing toward the future while clinging fiercely to ideals of loyalty and imperial duty. Ishii navigated this world with ease. At Tokyo Imperial University, he quickly excelled in bacteriology, fascinated by the unseen worlds that could bring armies to their knees. He saw microorganisms not as microscopic curiosities, but as weapons, as invisible blades capable of rewriting the rules of war. While other students studied medicine to heal, Ishii studied it to manipulate and control. His professors admired his brilliance, but whispered about his lack of empathy. He handled animal labs with an almost mechanical detachment, analyzing their suffering with the blank curiosity of a child taking apart a toy. His reports were meticulous, his predictions frighteningly accurate. He argued boldly in academic circles that the future of warfare would not be decided by bullets or bombs, but by bacteria, viruses, and toxins. He believed that Japan, if it wished to rise as a global empire, needed to master these tools before any other nation. His ambition did not go unnoticed. Military officials began attending his lectures. Government ministers invited him to private meetings. Ishii cultivated their attention with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. He spoke of the West's growing research in biological weapons, real or exaggerated, and insisted Japan must not fall behind. He crafted speeches that wrapped horror in patriotism, justifying unspeakable acts as necessary sacrifices for the greater good. When the Japanese military wanted proof of his theories, Ishii found ways to provide it. He traveled abroad, studying water sanitation systems in Europe and the United States, all while secretly observing vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He returned home with reports that impressed commanders, emphasizing that foreign nations were already preparing for biological warfare, even when they were not. His alarms created urgency. Urgency opened budgets. Budgets gave birth to power. Ishii knew exactly how to climb a ladder, and he climbed it quickly. Yet the transformation from visionary scientist to architect of atrocities did not happen overnight. It was gradual, built on a foundation of unchecked authority and a belief that the ends always justified the means. Ishii's thinking grew more dangerous as his influence expanded. He argued that true breakthroughs required experiments on living human subjects, claiming that animal models were insufficient. In closed meetings, he insisted that Japan's enemies were numerous enough to provide such material. And behind locked doors, he began to outline the blueprints for a new kind of research facility, one removed from prying eyes, one guarded by loyal soldiers, one where human life held no value.
The political climate made his ascent even easier. The Empire of Japan was tightening its grip on Asia, fueled by nationalism, militarism, and a hunger for expansion. Manchuria, seized and renamed Manchukuo, became a playground for military ambition. It was lawless enough, distant enough, and controlled enough to build whatever the empire desired. Ishii saw this territory not as a conquered land, but as a blank canvas, perfect for the monstrous vision forming in his mind. He proposed the establishment of a secret biological research center under the guise of a water purification facility. He spoke eloquently about the need for Japan to defend itself against possible biological attacks. The military approved the plan with enthusiasm. Funding poured in, and Ishii, for the first time, tasted the full power he had craved. His first facility was modest compared to what Unit 731 would later become, but it laid the foundation. In these early years, he tested bacteria on prisoners captured in small skirmishes, disguised the deaths as illnesses, buried evidence, and refined his methods. The results were horrifying, yet Ishii regarded them as breakthroughs. Each successful infection, each recorded reaction, each corpse dissected for data, strengthened his belief that he was building the future of warfare. His ambitions quickly outgrew that initial sight. He needed more space, more subjects, more equipment, more control. And so he turned his gaze toward Pingfang, a quiet village surrounded by open land, close to railways, easily secured by military force. He presented his plan for a massive complex capable of housing thousands of staff, laboratories, crematories, living quarters, and fields for outdoor experiments. A fortress masquerading as a research center. The military approved it without hesitation. When Ishii first arrived in Pingfang, stepping out of the car that carried him through the arched gates of the new facility, He paused to take in the cold, empty land. Snow drifted across the ground in thin sheets. The villagers watched from afar, shivering under their coats. To them, he looked like an officer, one of many who came and went during the occupation. They could not see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the way he scanned the landscape, already envisioning the walls that would rise, the laboratories that would hum with electricity, the chambers that would soon echo with human agony. He greeted the officers who awaited him with a nod, his expression unreadable. Inside his chest, however, something stirred. Satisfaction, perhaps. Triumph. And beneath those emotions, something colder. Something like anticipation.
Construction began immediately. Ishii oversaw every detail, ensuring the laboratories were sealed, the drainage systems hidden, the furnaces positioned away from public view. He ordered new equipment from Japan, machines so advanced that the villagers who glimpsed them being unloaded from trucks thought they were weapons. They weren't wrong. In Ishii's hands, scientific tools became weapons of a far more insidious nature. With each passing month, the facility grew larger. Barbed wires snaked across the fields. Guard towers rose like metal skeletons. Roads were paved to accommodate the constant stream of supplies. Soldiers patrolled day and night, their presence a warning that no one should come near. The villagers learned to avert their eyes whenever a convoy passed, sensing instinctively that this place was no ordinary military installation. Inside the compound, Ishii shaped his creation with the precision of a master craftsman. He selected staff from universities, laboratories, and hospitals across Japan. Many were brilliant scientists, drawn by the promise of unlimited funding and freedom from ethical constraints. Others were military physicians, lured by promotions and status. Most arrived believing they would contribute to Japan's scientific advancement. Only a few understood the true purpose, and they were the ones Ishii trusted most. He established rules that turned human beings into units of experimentation. Captured civilians became maruta, the Japanese word for logs, a term chosen deliberately to strip them of identity, to make the scientists believe they were cutting wood rather than cutting flesh. Ishii understood the power of language. Once a person is no longer seen as human, the mind finds it easier to inflict suffering. As the research expanded, so did Ishii's confidence. He walked through the laboratories with the assurance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He reviewed reports that documented unimaginable horrors, marking them with corrections and suggestions as casually as a professor grading papers. He lectured his staff on proper infection techniques, emphasized the importance of precise measurements, and demanded absolute secrecy. Anyone who questioned him, even slightly, was reassigned, removed, or threatened into silence. What frightened those around him most was how ordinary he appeared while orchestrating such brutality. He laughed at social gatherings, told jokes during official meetings, and wrote letters home speaking fondly of his achievements. To Ishii, none of this was cruelty. It was progress. He believed the empire needed his work. He believed his experiments would save countless Japanese lives in future wars. And he believed that the people who perished under his commands were simply casualties of scientific necessity.
As the facility neared completion, Ishii stood on the highest tower one evening, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The sky glowed red, and the smoke from the furnaces drifted upward in slow, lazy coils. He breathed in the cold air, feeling invigorated. Below him, workers hammered the last beams into place. The laboratories hummed with electricity. Guards paced the perimeter. And somewhere beyond the gates, the villagers huddled in fear of the empire rising beside them. Ishii felt no guilt, no hesitation, no remorse. He saw only the realization of a dream a dream that would soon become the world's worst nightmare. He descended the tower, his footsteps echoing on the metal stairs, and walked toward the main laboratory where the first shipment of prisoners was being unloaded. The soldiers pushed the frightened captives forward, their breath turning white in the freezing air. Ishii watched their trembling figures with an expression that was neither sympathy nor cruelty. It was simply interest, the interest of a man about to begin a grand experiment. Thus began the true birth of Unit 731, a place where science and suffering would merge, a place where Ishii Shiro's vision would reshape the limits of horror, a place where thousands would perish in the name of progress. And the world, unaware of the storm gathering in Manchuria, continued turning quietly, oblivious to the monstrous creation now standing behind the walls of Pingfang. The gates of the Pingfang facility were not tall enough to touch the sky, yet to those who passed through them, they felt as immense and final as the doors of an underworld. Their thick steel bars were forged not only to keep intruders out, but to seal horrors within. The sound they made when closing, heavy, metallic, echoing, lingered like a heartbeat in the cold air. Once the gates shut, nothing that lived behind them would return unchanged. Most would not return at all. The villagers of Pingfang watched from a distance as more soldiers, more equipment, and more prisoners moved through those gates. Their warnings, prayers, and whispers floated uselessly in the wind. Beyond that threshold, the world twisted into something unrecognizable. There, the concept of mercy dissolved. There, science shed its final layer of humanity. There, Ishii Shiro's cold vision took shape in steel and concrete. Inside the compound, the landscape resembled a grim industrial city. Rows of identical buildings stretched across the grounds, each one constructed with purpose. Some structures held laboratories, their windows frosted by cold and secrecy. Others housed prisons, bordered by electrified fences that hummed quietly at night. A tall smokestack, its shadow stretching like a skeletal finger, released a constant plume of smoke that stained the sky with gray and black streaks. The air tasted of chemicals, metal, and something harder to define, something thick that clung to the tongue.
Yellow signs marked with red warnings dotted the facility. They carried symbols indicating contagion, toxicity, or restricted zones. Yet the meaning behind these warnings went far beyond any symbol. Everyone inside understood the unspoken rule: do not ask questions. Curiosity within these walls was more dangerous than the diseases cultivated in its laboratories. The arrival protocol for new prisoners was swift, practiced, and devoid of emotion. After being unloaded from the death trains, the captives were stripped of their belongings, their clothes, and their names. Their hair was cut short, their faces were shaved, their identities were erased piece by piece until nothing remained but numbers, recorded on small cards that would follow them into the laboratories. These numbers were pinned to their garments, scratched into logs, and etched into reports. They became data points long before they became corpses. The prisoners were divided into categories: men in one group, women in another, children in yet another. Guards handled them with mechanical efficiency, using practiced movements learned from months of repetition. Some captives trembled, others remained frozen in shock, and a few stared blankly at the ground, their spirits already broken. The guards did not see them as people. Ishii made sure of that. The word maruta, logs, echoed subtly through the facility, a linguistic weapon designed to kill compassion. The internal prison units were dim, cold, and damp. Each cell contained only a wooden plank for a bed and a small bucket for waste. Bars were spaced too closely for fingers to slip through. Above the cells, narrow windows allowed only thin slivers of light to enter, creating shadows that stretched across the floor like dark veins. Guards patrolled the hallways with rifles and batons, their footsteps measured, their expressions blank. They seldom spoke, as though silence itself were part of their uniform. The facility did not allow idle moments. Every hour had purpose, every movement had direction. At dawn, scientists and physicians arrived at the laboratories, donning rubber aprons, gloves, goggles, and masks, layers of protection for the tasks ahead. Assistants prepared instruments, scalpels sharpened to metallic whispers, glass tubes sterilized, syringes arranged in perfect rows, notebooks opened beside stainless steel trays. The lab smelled of disinfectant and rot, creating an odor so distinct and suffocating that newcomers to the staff gagged for days. The vivisection rooms were among the most chilling places within the facility. Long tables with leather restraints stood in neat lines. Overhead, bright lamps cast harsh, white circles of light that illuminated every detail with merciless clarity. Cabinets along the walls contained jars filled with preserved organs, lungs swollen with infection, hearts mottled with disease, limbs severed for study. The scientists treated these collections as trophies of knowledge, pieces of a puzzle they were determined to complete no matter the cost.
Pressure chambers stood in another wing. These were reinforced rooms where metal dials measured rising force and walls groaned under invisible weight. The chambers were designed to study the effects of extreme conditions on the human body. Tubes, gauges, and levers formed a twisted network around them, resembling the veins of a mechanical beast. Nearby were frostbite rooms, cold chambers where temperatures were manipulated with precision. Ice lined the walls, and floors glistened with frost that never melted. The corridors outside these rooms were littered with buckets of water and sheets of ice, tools used for experiments that would make even seasoned soldiers avert their eyes. Disease labs were isolated in an inner section guarded by double doors. Inside, rows of cages held infected rats, fleas, and other carriers. Scientists in protective suits moved carefully between them, marking the progress of epidemics they had manufactured. Behind glass panels, cultures swirled in flasks, their colors changing as bacteria multiplied. In these rooms, invisible death grew quietly, waiting to be used on unsuspecting victims. There was also the crematorium, its furnaces roaring day and night. A line of chimneys spewed smoke that drifted over the compound and sometimes into the village beyond. Workers in heavy gloves and smudged aprons managed the fires with practiced monotony. Bodies arrived on carts, sometimes still warm. The workers showed no emotion. To them, the dead were simply residues of experiments, tasks to be completed before the next batch arrived. Between all these structures were narrow alleys where snow gathered in uneven piles. The wind carried faint echoes, soft thuds, metallic clinks, occasionally muffled cries. No one acknowledged the sounds. They were part of the environment, as normal as the clatter of tools or the rustle of lab coats. Every person inside the compound, scientist, soldier, assistant, lived under unspoken threat. Ishii's presence, though not constant, was felt everywhere. His ambitions seeped through the walls, shaping the culture of the entire facility. He demanded results, precision, and loyalty. Any failure was seen as sabotage. Any doubt was viewed as weakness. Many staff members feared Ishii even more than the diseases they handled. He rewarded obedience with promotions and punished hesitation with reassignment to riskier tasks. A few who expressed moral doubts were quietly removed, their fate unknown. Despite the suffocating atmosphere, some staff members found ways to cope. They convinced themselves the prisoners were criminals, rebels, or enemies of the empire. They focused solely on their data, pretending the suffering they witnessed was not real. They avoided looking into the eyes of the captives. They trained their minds to see bodies instead of people. They surrounded themselves with numbers, charts, and measurements, burying their conscience under layers of scientific detachment.
For others, the transformation into cruelty was disturbingly easy. Power, authority,
and a sense of immunity eroded their empathy. They performed tasks with enthusiasm, taking pride in efficiency. They competed for Ishii's favor, seeing the maruta not as victims, but as opportunities for advancement. Some even volunteered for the most horrific experiments, believing they were serving their nation. But not everyone drank the poison of indifference equally. A few assistants found themselves waking at night with trembling hands, sweating from nightmares of the faces they had seen strapped to the tables. Some wrote letters home filled with vague descriptions of difficult work, unable to confess the truth even to themselves. Fear kept them silent, chained to their roles within the machine Ishii had built. As days turned into weeks, the facility grew more alive in its own twisted way. Experiments were scheduled like clockwork. Results flowed into thick journals. Reports traveled to Tokyo. Ishii reviewed everything, signing off on procedures that erased dozens of lives at a time. He walked through the compound occasionally, inspecting the progress, his polished boots clicking against the concrete. Guards snapped to attention when he passed. Scientists lowered their heads. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The maruta who survived initial evaluations were moved deeper into the facility, toward the laboratories that awaited them. They shuffled through corridors under watchful eyes, their feet dragging across cold floors. The walls around them bore faint stains from those who had walked before. Some prisoners were eerily silent, resigned to their fate. Others trembled uncontrollably, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding around them. A few clung to faint hopes that this was temporary, believing military camps always involved hardship. But as they passed the cold rooms, the pressure chambers, and the vivisection tables, hope drained from their faces like water seeping into dry earth. Each step inside this compound felt like a descent into a place with no bottom. The deeper one went, the more the world outside faded. Time twisted strangely within these walls. Days blurred together, measured only by the rhythm of experiments and the ever-burning furnaces of the crematorium. The sun occasionally broke through the smoke above, but its light felt distant, powerless to touch the ground. In this closed world, Ishii's vision operated with ruthless precision. Every scream, every gasp, every death was recorded. Every result became a data point. Every body became fuel for the next experiment. The facility was a self-sustaining engine of suffering, designed to function until there was nothing left to consume.
The gates that separated Pingfang from Unit 731 were more than physical barriers. They were thresholds between humanity and its opposite. Outside the gates, life continued with its simple rhythms, markets, families, seasons, traditions. Inside the gates, life was stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but cold calculations. Unit 731 was no longer just a facility. It had become an ecosystem, a factory, a nightmare given structure. And at its center, Ishii Shiro stood proudly, the architect of a new era of scientific brutality. What awaited the prisoners beyond those iron gates would defy imagination. What awaited the world if Ishii's research succeeded would be far worse. The machinery was ready, the staff was prepared, the laboratories were waiting. The first snow of winter fell silently over Pingfang as dawn broke, coating the ground in a thin veil of white. Outside the walls of Unit 731, the fields sparkled softly beneath the pale morning light. But inside the compound, winter only deepened the cold already rooted in every stone and corridor. The air felt heavier, the walls seemed to draw closer, And behind every sealed door, preparations were underway for the experiments that would define the true nature of the facility. To the prisoners, now stripped of names, histories, and identities, the complex had become a labyrinth of dread. They sensed the shift before any announcement was made. Guards moved differently, more briskly. Scientists entered the laboratories earlier, carrying trays covered with cloths that concealed instruments chosen for the day's procedures. Assistants whispered less. Even the furnaces of the crematorium seemed to burn hotter, as if preparing for a heavier burden. The maruta were lined up in the corridors outside the laboratories. Their bodies shivered in the freezing air, their breaths forming clouds that quickly dissolved into the hallway's stale atmosphere. Some stared blankly at the floor, their minds already broken. Others clutched their arms tightly, trying desperately to cling to scraps of warmth. A few scanned the surroundings with wide, frantic eyes, attempting to piece together a sense of what awaited them. They would soon learn. The doors to the vivisection wing swung open, releasing a wave of disinfectant scent mingled with something far darker, an odor that settled deep in the lungs like a shadow one could breathe. Scientists in rubber aprons and masks emerged, their faces obscured, their bodies wrapped in layers of protection. Their gloved hands carried notebooks, metal tools, and sterilized trays. None acknowledged the prisoners waiting outside. They walked past them with detachment of engineers inspecting machinery before a long day's work.
Inside the vivisection rooms, the metal tables gleamed under the harsh lights. Restraints lined their edges, prepared to hold limbs in place. The floor beneath each table bore the faded marks of countless procedures performed before. On nearby shelves, jars filled with organs preserved in solution glimmered softly under the lamps, silent witnesses to previous experiments. The first group of prisoners was brought in. The guards guided them forward with firm grips and unyielding expressions. Some captives resisted instinctively, their knees buckling, their bodies trembling violently. But resistance only prolonged the process. The guards were well practiced, and within moments the prisoners were secured to the tables, their wrists and ankles bound by leather straps that tightened sharply against their skin. The scientists worked efficiently. Pages in their notebooks rustled as they prepared to record observations. Assistants adjusted the lamps to illuminate the subjects fully. Metal instruments clinked softly, each sound echoing through the cold room like footsteps in an empty church. What followed was a slow unraveling of human endurance. The researchers began with controlled incisions, studying the reactions of muscles, tissues, and nerves. They measured the spread of infection in wounds deliberately left untreated. They observed the effects of frostbite by exposing limbs to ice water until the skin turned pale, stiff, and brittle. The scientists monitored how long it took for blood flow to cease, for cellular structures to break down, for the flesh to deaden. They recorded every change meticulously, driven not by malice, but by a cold pursuit of data. Pain, for the maruta, became a language spoken through trembling breaths and strained muscles. The laboratories absorbed their cries, swallowing them into the stone walls. Some captives fainted from agony, only to be revived so the experiment could continue. Others remained conscious throughout, their minds trapped inside their suffering, unable to escape. In the next room, frostbite experiments unfolded with chilling precision. The subjects were led into chambers where temperatures dropped below freezing. Water was poured over exposed skin, forming layers of ice that crackled softly. Scientists observed how long it took for frostbite to take hold, noting the transformation of skin from pink to white, from white to bluish black.
They tapped the frozen flesh with slender rods, listening for the hollow sound that signaled deep tissue damage. When the frostbite reached its peak, the subjects were returned to the vivisection rooms for further study. Their limbs were dissected, veins examined, bone marrow scraped. Each detail added to Ishii's growing collection of data on hypothermic injury, information he believed could help Japanese soldiers survive the brutal winters of warfare.
Across the compound, another set of experiments was underway. The pressure chambers, silent, towering structures of reinforced steel, stood ready. Inside these rooms, the scientists manipulated atmospheric pressure with mathematical precision. They increased the internal force gradually, observing the effects on the human body. At first, the subjects experienced headaches and dizziness. As pressure climbed, their veins bulged, their lungs strained, their bodies contorted under the invisible weight. The scientists took careful notes on the limits of human endurance, documenting how long the maruta survived before airflow ceased or organs ruptured. They monitored every detail, their faces hidden behind masks, their emotions sealed beneath layers of sterile fabric. In another wing, poison experiments moved forward with equal ruthlessness. Scientists administered toxins through food, air, injections, or contact with skin. They studied the progression of symptoms: rapid heartbeat, seizures, internal bleeding, paralysis. They observed how quickly each poison acted, how effectively it incapacitated, how thoroughly it killed. The maruta writhed on cots, their bodies reacting violently as the toxins coursed through their veins. Assistants timed the reactions, occasionally adjusting doses to refine their conclusions. Every experiment, no matter how gruesome, was treated as research. Every victim became a vessel for data. Every death was followed by dissection, the body studied from the inside out. Knowledge was extracted with brutal efficiency, written into thick volumes of records stored in locked cabinets deep within the facility. The scientists believed these experiments had purpose. They convinced themselves their work would give Japan an advantage in coming battles. They believed suffering was simply a requirement of progress. And under Ishii's leadership, every doubt that flickered in their minds was extinguished. What made these experiments even more horrifying was the silence surrounding them. Outside the walls of Unit 731, the world continued unaware. The snow fell quietly. The villagers tended their fires. Children played in the streets. But within the compound, winter was no shield from cruelty. It only made the suffering more vivid, the cold amplifying the agony of those subjected to frost, infection, and dissection. Sometimes at night, when the experiments were finished for the day and the laboratories were cleaned, a strange stillness settled over the compound. The lights dimmed, the halls emptied, and the only sounds were the soft hum of generators and the crackling of the crematorium fires. In those rare quiet moments, the true weight of the day lingered heavily over the facility. The walls seemed to absorb the pain, storing it like a cursed memory. Even the air felt saturated with despair.
But Ishii Shiro saw only progress. He reviewed the reports each evening, flipping through pages filled with diagrams, measurements, and observations. The data pleased him. He highlighted sections, added comments, and planned improvements for future experiments. To him, Unit 731 was functioning exactly as intended. The suffering within its walls was merely a byproduct of scientific advancement. He did not see the hollow eyes of the maruta. He did not hear their muffled cries. He did not think of their families, their homes, their lives before capture. Ishii's world was one of results, charts, and theories, and as long as the data continued to grow, he allowed the experiments to expand. The guards also learned to ignore the horror. Their days were filled with enforcing order, transporting captives, and maintaining control. Fear of punishment kept them obedient. Some found a cold numbness in routine. Others embraced cruelty as power. Yet a few, late at night, stared at the snow outside the barracks and wondered what would become of their souls when the war ended. For the maruta, the days blended into an unending cycle of suffering. They could not grasp time, could not measure weeks or months. They survived moment to moment, breath to breath. The facility stole everything from them: identity, dignity, hope. Many perished within the first few weeks. Those who lasted longer endured experiments that stripped away their humanity piece by piece. And yet, even amid such overwhelming darkness, traces of human will flickered faintly. Some maruta resisted silently, holding memories of loved ones close like embers in the cold. Others whispered prayers under their breath, though no one heard them above the echoes of pain. A few clung to the faint belief that one day someone might learn what happened within these walls. But for now, Unit 731 remained sealed tightly, its secrets growing deeper each day. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, the machinery of suffering moved with relentless precision. The experiments expanded in scope and ambition, and Ishii's hunger for knowledge only intensified. The human laboratory of Unit 731 had begun its darkest chapter, and the world had yet to realize the scale of the nightmare unfolding in the frozen heart of Manchuria.
In the deepest corners of Unit 731, hidden behind sealed doors and guarded corridors, another nightmare was quietly blooming. It was not the sound of metal instruments or the cold glint of scalpels that defined this part of the compound. It was something far more insidious, something that moved invisibly, silently, spreading with a whisper rather than a scream. It was the realm of disease. Here, within sterile glass chambers and jars teeming with microscopic life, the scientists of Unit 731 crafted weapons capable of erasing entire villages with the same ease as one might strike a match. The disease wing of the compound possessed a different kind of stillness than the vivisection rooms. There were no restraints here, no metal tables glistening under surgical lamps. Instead, rows of benches held glass flasks filled with swirling liquids of pale green, thick yellow, or murky brown. Under microscopes, countless organisms multiplied rapidly: bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and strains engineered to thrive in the harsh cold of Manchuria. The scientists tended to these cultures like gardeners tending to poisonous flowers, watching them grow, mutate, and strengthen. The air in these rooms hummed with a low vibration produced by incubators and refrigeration units. It smelled faintly of disinfectant, but beneath that sterile facade lingered a rotten sweetness, the scent of swelling cultures and decaying organic matter. This odor seeped into the clothing of researchers, clinging to their gloves and masks, following them like a ghostly stain. They grew accustomed to it, accepting it as part of their daily routine. Only newcomers gagged at first, their stomachs churning as they adjusted to the invisible death saturating the environment. Scientists moved through the laboratories with purpose, their notebooks tucked under their arms, their eyes scanning charts and dials. They measured bacterial growth rates with meticulous precision. They tested how quickly viruses spread across tissue samples. They recorded the effectiveness of fleas as carriers, monitoring how diseases leapt from one organism to another with terrifying efficiency. Every step, every observation, every experiment contributed to the expanding arsenal of biological weapons Ishii intended to unleash. The maruta were integral to these experiments. They were kept in adjacent chambers, separated by thick glass windows that allowed scientists to observe symptoms as they appeared. In one room, a group of prisoners shivered violently, their bodies drenched in sweat despite the cold. Their eyes were glassy, unfocused. Darkening swellings, buboes, rose beneath their arms and along their necks as the plague consumed them. The scientists watched closely, noting how long it took for the first signs to appear, how quickly the fever rose, how rapidly the infection spread between individuals confined to the same space.
Some maruta were intentionally exposed to diseases by direct injection. Others were placed in rooms filled with contaminated air. Still others were tied to stakes outside, where plague-infected fleas were released upon their skin, allowed to bite freely as the scientists recorded the insects' feeding habits. No matter the method, the goal remained the same: observe, measure, refine. The suffering of the maruta in these experiments was different from that in the vivisection labs. It was quieter, more drawn out. Instead of screams, the disease wing echoed with weak coughing, labored breathing, and the faint sound of bodies shifting restlessly on wooden floors. Some prisoners clung to each other for warmth, their fevers burning through their thin clothing. Others lay motionless, their eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, trapped between delirium and despair. A few tried to resist infection by holding their breath or covering their mouths with their hands, but such efforts were futile. Death hovered over them like a patient guest, waiting for the right moment to settle. Outside the disease chambers, the scientists made plans for larger-scale tests. Ishii believed that real insight could only be gained through live field trials. It was not enough to study infections in confined rooms. He wanted to see how diseases moved through villages, how they spread among families, how they traveled with wind and water. He wanted to know how long it took for a contagion to wipe out an entire community. To achieve this, Unit 731 conducted experiments across the countryside surrounding Pingfang. Small ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped from airplanes onto unsuspecting villages. These devices shattered upon impact, releasing clouds of insects that swarmed upon villagers, livestock, and crops. Within days, the first symptoms appeared: swollen lymph nodes, fever, vomiting, and eventually death. Entire settlements were consumed, their streets littered with bodies. Survivors, terrified and delirious, fled to nearby towns, unknowingly spreading the infection further. In other cases, water supplies were deliberately contaminated. Streams and wells near remote villages were laced with cholera or typhoid bacteria. Families drank from these sources, unaware that each sip carried death. The diseases swept through populations swiftly, leaving homes empty and fields untended. The Japanese army often arrived soon afterward to document the aftermath, collecting samples and assessing the success of the experiment. They often burned the villages afterward, not as an act of mercy, but to eliminate traces of the operation.
The disease wing of Unit 731 was also involved in researching weapon delivery methods. Scientists tested how various diseases reacted to temperature changes, humidity levels, and exposure to sunlight. They developed bombs that would preserve bacteria during flight, ensuring they remained deadly when dispersed. They experimented with coatings that allowed fleas to survive long enough to infect large areas upon release. Each innovation brought Ishii one step closer to achieving his dream of an unstoppable biological arsenal. Inside the compound, the maruta continued to suffer.
Some developed massive blisters that ruptured, leaving raw flesh exposed to the cold. Others coughed blood, staining their clothes with dark flecks. A few wandered in circles, hallucinating, their minds eroded by fever. The scientists watched with fascination, recording each symptom, each stage of decline. They timed every detail, the onset of pain, the duration of convulsions, the moment of collapse, the final breath. Not all maruta died immediately. Some lingered for days or even weeks, their bodies racked with pain. Their skin changed color as infections spread, yellow from jaundice, blue from cyanosis, mottled crimson from internal bleeding. Their voices weakened until they could barely whisper. In the final hours, most fell into a coma-like states. When death came, it was often a relief, though no one inside the facility saw it that way. Death was merely the end of a test, the completion of a dataset. The bodies were removed, dissected, and then burned without ceremony. The scientists maintained careful logs of each experiment. These books filled shelves within Ishii's private archive, forming a growing library of suffering. Each page chronicled the destruction of a human life in precise, clinical language. Ishii reviewed these logs regularly, searching for patterns and insights. He praised efficiency, encouraged innovation, and demanded constant refinement. His vision was relentless, moving from one experiment to the next like a storm sweeping across the land. The disease experiments did not just affect the maruta and the surrounding villages. They also affected the staff of Unit 731. Some researchers fell ill after accidental exposure, their bodies succumbing to the very pathogens they had nurtured. A few assistants collapsed in the hallways, coughing blood. Others developed fevers that doctors struggled to diagnose, fearing an outbreak within the facility. Ishii ordered strict quarantine protocols whenever infection threatened to spread among staff, not out of compassion, but to protect his research. Workers who succumbed were quietly removed and never mentioned again.
Despite these risks, the scientists continued their work undeterred. They convinced themselves they were serving their nation. Some believed their research would help Japan defend itself against Western powers. Others simply followed orders, their ambition or fear driving them forward. The truth, however, was that Unit 731 existed outside the boundaries of morality. Behind its walls, suffering became a commodity, pain became ada, and death became routine. The disease wing expanded its operations as the war progressed. New pathogens were introduced, new delivery methods tested, new villages targeted. The maruta remained the central resource, their bodies used to fuel the research machine. The experiments grew more ambitious, more destructive. Ishii envisioned a future where entire cities could be crippled by a single bomb, where armies could be defeated without a shot fired. In this vision, the maruta were merely starting points, small-scale trials for a global strategy. Outside the facility, winter storms swept across Manchuria. Snow buried the fields, muffling the sounds of distant villages. The villagers of Pingfang lived in quiet fear, aware that something monstrous lurked behind the walls, but unable to fathom the extent of its cruelty. They saw the smoke rise each day, they felt the shift in the wind, and some nights, when the wind blew from the north, they caught faint traces of the same rotten sweetness that permeated the disease labs, a scent that carried unseen death. Inside the compound, the suffering continued unabated. The maruta grew weaker, their numbers dwindling, yet new captives arrived regularly to replace them. The laboratories never ran empty, the journals never stopped filling, the furnaces never cooled. Unit 731 had become a factory of disease, churning out weapons invisible to the naked eye, yet devastating in their reach. It had become a hive where scientists labored tirelessly to perfect the art of death without gunfire. It had become the embodiment of Ishii Shiro's cruelest ambition. And as the experiments intensified, so too did the shadows of consequence, shadows that would stretch far beyond the walls of Pingfang, staining history forever.
Long before the furnaces of Unit 731 burned their hottest, Long before plague fleas swarmed across villages and vivisection tables gleamed under brutal white light, the death trains were already carving paths through Manchuria like iron serpents carrying sorrow. To the villagers who lived near the tracks, these trains were omens. They arrived without schedule, without warning, without destination. Their arrival was marked not by steam or whistles, but by the heavy silence that followed in their wake, as though the land itself recognized them. The trains usually came at night. In the distance, faint vibrations trembled through the earth long before the engines were visible. Livestock stirred uneasily, dogs howled, children woke, trembling, sensing something approaching that they could not name. When the train finally appeared, its dim lamps cast long shadows across the snow-covered fields, turning the landscape into a patchwork of gray ghosts. No villagers approached the tracks when the death trains passed. Even the bravest among them watched from distant windows, barely daring to breathe. Soldiers stood on every wagon, rifles slung to their chests, their faces expressionless. Their silence was more terrifying than any shouted order. The carts behind the engine were locked tightly, their doors reinforced with chains. No sound escaped from within, no cries, no pleading, no movement. Yet everyone knew what lay inside. Prisoners from across occupied territories, Chinese farmers, Korean laborers, Mongolian villagers, Soviet captives, were crammed into those cars. Some were rebels. Some were bystanders swept up in military sweeps. Some were simply unfortunate people who crossed paths with the wrong patrol. None knew they were being taken to Unit 731. None knew they were entering a place where survival was impossible. Their journey began the moment the doors clanged shut. Inside the cars, darkness reigned. The air was thick, stale, and suffocating. Bodies pressed against bodies, strangers forced together in fear. The only sounds were heavy breathing, quiet sobs, and the clatter of the train wheels. Those who attempted to speak found their voices swallowed by despair. Time stretched endlessly, measured only by the jolt of the train as it crossed uneven tracks.
Many prisoners had no idea how far they were being taken. Some believed they were heading to labor camps. Others thought they were being transported for interrogation. A few clung to the faint hope that they would be exchanged or released. But as the train continued into colder, more remote landscapes, dread took root. Their fate remained sealed within the metal walls of the car, each passing hour pulling them deeper into Ishii's domain. When the trains finally approached Pingfang, the prisoners inside sensed a shift. The engine slowed, grinding over the final stretch of tracks. The faint glow of the facility's lights seeped through cracks in the cars. Some prisoners pressed their faces against the wooden slats, trying to catch a glimpse of their destination. What they saw was a compound surrounded by tall fences and looming guard towers, structures that resembled a fortress more than a research facility. As the train came to a stop, soldiers marched forward in rigid formation. They unlocked the cars with sharp metallic clacks that echoed through the frosty air. When the doors opened, a blast of cold wind rushed inside, carrying the scent of smoke and chemicals. The prisoners recoiled, blinking in the sudden light. Some stumbled out, their legs too weak to support their weight. Others were dragged from the cars by guards who grabbed them roughly by the arms. The process was swift. The prisoners were counted, sorted, and stripped of belongings. Some arrived with nothing but the clothes they wore. Others carried small trinkets, a bracelet, a family photo, a carved piece of wood. These items were confiscated, tossed into crates, and carted away. Whatever meaning they once held evaporated in the cold air of Unit 731. From this moment forward, nothing personal belonged to them, not even their bodies. The guards moved the captives toward a processing building near the entrance of the facility. Here, names were replaced with numbers. Identities were erased with the stroke of a pen. The prisoners were forced to stand in line as their details were recorded. Their arms and legs were measured for experiment suitability. Their teeth were inspected for signs of disease. Their skin was examined for scarring or wounds. Some were deemed unusable and sent directly to the crematorium. Most were labeled maruta logs, fit for experiments.
The death trains never stayed long. Once the prisoners were emptied from their cars, the soldiers inspected the wagons, ensuring no one had escaped. The floors of the cars were often stained with sweat, blood, or fluids from those who had collapsed during the journey. Any bodies left inside were removed, dragged away without ceremony, and added to the piles awaiting disposal. The doors were shut again, the engine roared, and the train vanished into the darkness, leaving behind silence. That silence was the first sign to the villagers that the train had delivered its load. Behind the closed gates of the facility, the prisoners were herded through concrete corridors toward their assigned buildings. The maruta were sorted by age, gender, and physical condition. Families were separated immediately. Parents watched helplessly as their children were dragged away. Brothers were torn from sisters. Husbands were pulled from wives. Those forced to part knew they would never see each other again, though no one dared speak the truth. Some prisoners resisted even in their weakened state. They dropped to their knees, clinging to the ground. They dug their fingers into the dirt. They screamed silently, their voices raw from terror. The guards responded with swift violence, a strike of a rifle butt, a kick to the ribs, a pull by the collar. Resistance was futile. The machine of Unit 731 had no patience for defiance. Once inside the prison blocks, the maruta were pushed into cells so small that 4 people could barely sit side by side. The doors slammed shut. Darkness returned. But this darkness was different from the one inside the train. It was sharper, colder, heavier. It had weight. It had purpose. It closed around them like a fist. Some prisoners tried to comfort themselves by recalling home. They whispered the names of loved ones under their breath. They traced memories in their minds: warm meals, laughter, festivals, sunlight on fields. But as the hours passed, these memories grew faint. The cold air of Unit 731 seeped into their bones, numbing both body and mind. Occasionally, faint noises echoed through the corridors: metal clinks, muffled shouts, the scrape of wheels on concrete. The prisoners leaned toward the cell door, trying to understand the sounds around them. Some recognized the distant crackle of fires. Others heard strange buzzing noises from the insect wing. A few caught muffled screams that suddenly stopped as though swallowed by the walls. The maruta did not know the experiments had begun for others. Soon they too would be called.
The death trains continued their visits regularly, each arrival bringing a new wave of captives. Sometimes the wagons were filled with political prisoners captured during raids. Other times they carried entire families from villages that had resisted Japanese occupation. Still other trains transported prisoners of war captured during clashes with Soviet forces. It did not matter who they were or where they came from. Once the train doors opened, all were equal. Equal in their fate, equal in their suffering. As the months passed, the villagers of Pingfang began to dread the rumble of engines in the night. They closed their shutters when they heard the tracks groan beneath heavy wheels. They whispered prayers to ancestors, pleading for protection from the horror moving past their homes. Some believed the trains carried ghosts. Others believed they carried demons, but none suspected the full truth. Inside the facility, Ishii viewed the arrival of the trains with satisfaction. More subjects meant more experiments. More experiments meant more data. More data brought him closer to his vision of biological supremacy. He studied the logs of arrivals, ensuring a steady supply of prisoners. He held meetings with officers, discussing the transportation routes and timing. He regarded the trains not as instruments of suffering, but as vital arteries, feeding the body of his research empire. The maruta who arrived by train were often the most desperate. Many had gone days without food. Some had untreated injuries from the journey. Their spirits were already broken, crushed by fear and uncertainty. For Ishii, these conditions were irrelevant. In fact, the weakened state of these captives offered a variety of experimental opportunities. One day, a particularly large train arrived, carrying over 300 prisoners captured from rural villages near the Manchurian border. Among them were elders whose bodies shook from cold, women clutching infants who cried weakly, young men with their wrists bound tightly together. The soldiers unloaded them silently, separating the families with ease. Some captives had frostbite. Others were burning with fever. A few collapsed as soon as their feet touched the ground. The guards dragged them away, as though handling sacks of grain. This arrival would feed the experiments for weeks. The disease wing quickly claimed a portion of these new captives, assigning them to plague exposure rooms. The vivisection unit took those with the strongest physiques. The frostbite chamber received those with visible damage from the journey. The pressure chamber tests resumed with new subjects. Even the poison labs chose a handful for toxin experiments. Every part of Unit 731 benefited from the death trains. And yet, the trains never stopped. They were relentless, as reliable as the rising sun. Each night, their cold metal wheels brought new souls into Ishii's hands. Each morning, fewer maruta remained alive. Each evening, the prisoners prayed for dawn, though dawn brought only more suffering. The death trains became such a constant presence that the staff of Unit 731 stopped noticing them altogether. The guards no longer looked at the prisoners as they were unloaded. The scientists did not pause in their work when the engines rumbled outside. The furnaces burned steadily, ready to receive new bodies. The system operated with mechanical precision. But for the maruta, those trembling figures stepping out of darkness into the jaws of suffering, the death trains marked the beginning of the end. Their journey into Unit 731 was their final journey. Few would ever leave those walls. None would leave alive. The night swallowed the tracks again as each train retreated into the distance. Behind the gates, the prisoners waited for their turn. Outside the walls, the villagers shivered, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Inside the labs, Ishii's scientists sharpened their tools and prepared their charts. The death trains kept coming, and with them came the echoes of an entire world descending into shadows. Winter in Manchuria did not simply arrive, it consumed. It spread across the land with a merciless calm, slipping between the cracks of doors, burrowing into the marrow of bones, and numbing even the most resilient hearts. Outside Unit 731, villagers clung to firelight and prayer to survive the season. Inside the facility, however, winter was not merely endured, it was weaponized. The cold became a tool, a teacher, a tormentor. And in the frostbite wing of Unit 731, it became the architect of some of the most agonizing experiments the world would ever know.
To the maruta, the frostbite experiments began with a chilling silence. The prisoners selected for this wing were usually the strongest among those brought in by the death trains, men and women whose bodies appeared capable of withstanding prolonged exposure. The guards examined their limbs, searching for signs of health and circulation. Those with thick skin or sturdy muscle were considered suitable material for winter studies. The frostbite building stood apart from the main laboratories, enclosed by walls that trapped the cold like a prison holds its inmates. Snow piled against its sides, untouched by footsteps, as though the earth itself refused to approach it. The door was heavy, reinforced with metal, and each time it opened, a slice of frigid air escaped, carrying with it a whisper of the horrors inside. The experiments began with forced exposure. Prisoners were dragged into the chamber, where temperatures dropped far below freezing. A basin of water sat at the center of the room, its surface rippling softly under dim lights. One by one, maruta were ordered to place their arms or legs into the icy water. The liquid coated their skin, quickly crystallizing into a thin shell of frost. Scientists observed the process carefully, watching how the skin changed, how the veins slowed, how the fingers stiffened. They wrote notes with steady hands, unaffected by the trembling and gasping just a few feet away. Outside the room, assistants prepared buckets of snow and trays of ice, tools that would be used to accelerate the freezing process. The cold bit into the maruta with ferocity. It crept slowly at first, tingling, stiffening, numbing. Then it surged, cutting sharply through flesh, burrowing deep into nerves. The prisoners' bodies convulsed as the cold took hold. Their chests rose and fell rapidly as panic began to spread faster than frost. The scientists listened for a specific sound, one that signaled the completion of the freezing process. When they tapped the limbs gently with metal rods, a hollow knocking echoed in the chamber. It was the sound of flesh frozen solid, like wood struck in winter. The frost had reached the bone. Once the freezing was complete, the maruta were removed from the chamber and taken to the adjacent laboratory, where warmer temperatures awaited. The sudden shift from cold to relative warmth was not a mercy. It was another phase of observation. Scientists tracked how quickly frostbite spread inward. They watched the skin thaw, blister, darken, and rot. In some cases, the limbs were left untreated for days to document the natural progression of tissue death. In others, limbs were forcibly thawed with heated air or placed in warm water to study the effects of rapid temperature change.
The suffering that accompanied thawing was overwhelming. Pins and needles erupted beneath the skin, followed by burning, then waves of pain that seemed to claw upward through nerves toward the spine. Some maruta convulsed uncontrollably. Others fell into catatonia, their minds shutting down from shock. Scientists recorded each reaction with precision. Then came the dissections. The frozen limbs, sometimes still attached to living bodies, were cut open with surgical tools. The flesh inside revealed the ravages of frostbite in horrifying detail. Muscles had turned gray and fibrous, blood vessels collapsed inward, skin peeled away in layers. Scientists measured the extent of damage, comparing it with charts and diagrams pinned to the walls. They treated each body like an anatomical landscape, exploring every inch in search of data. But frostbite experiments were only one half of the winter horrors conducted inside Unit 731. The other involved hypothermia. Maruta were taken to open-air courtyards within the compound, where the winter wind howled like an animal searching for prey. The prisoners were stripped of most clothing and forced to stand in the blizzard until their bodies lost heat. Snow accumulated on their shoulders, their eyelashes, their hair. Their skin turned from pink to pale to blue as consciousness faded. Some were doused with cold water repeatedly, the liquid turning to ice moments after hitting their skin.
Others were bound in positions that ensured maximum exposure. The guards watched impassively, their breath forming clouds in the freezing night. The scientists recorded the subjects' body temperatures at intervals, noting how long it took for shivering to stop, how quickly confusion set in, how the heart rate slowed to a crawl. As hypothermia deepened, the maruta drifted into a fog of hallucinations and semi-consciousness. Their minds played tricks on them. They felt warmth where none existed. Some swayed gently as though listening to distant music. Others murmured quietly to themselves, whispering to memories or ghosts only they could see. The cold stripped away reality, leaving behind only fragments of thought. When the prisoners could no longer stand, they were placed on stretchers and taken indoors for further study. Some were revived using heated blankets and lamps. Others were left to die slowly, their bodies trembling uncontrollably until tremors stopped forever. A few survived long enough to undergo additional experiments, forced warming methods that included immersion in hot water, exposure to heat lamps, or even being pressed against the warm bodies of other prisoners. Each method offered new insights to the scientists, who stood by observing the reactions with clinical fascination.
The maruta were not the only ones affected by the winter hell. The staff of Unit 731 felt the weight of the cold as well, though their suffering was far removed from the horrors they inflicted. Guards wrapped themselves tightly in coats as they patrolled the icy grounds. Scientists kept their hands in heated gloves when not performing procedures. Assistants warmed their feet near furnaces before beginning their duties. Yet even with these precautions, frostbite nipped at the edges of their comfort, reminding them that nature itself was an unforgiving participant in the work they carried out. Some staff members began to show signs of strain as the winter deepened. Their eyes grew hollow, their faces turned gaunt, their movements slowed with fatigue. But they continued working, driven by Ishii's demands and by the knowledge that failure carried consequences. A few assistants collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies unable to withstand the relentless pace of winter experiments. They were quietly replaced. Among the scientists, there were those whose detachment faltered during the harshest days of winter. Some found themselves trembling not from cold, but from guilt that seeped into their hearts like frost into stone. They questioned their role in the torment, though only in the privacy of their minds. No one dared voice doubt aloud. Doubt was a luxury Unit 731 did not permit. At night, the frostbite wing exhaled a chilling stillness. The rooms grew quiet. The experiments paused. The only signs of life were the flickering lights along the corridors and the distant hum of generators. In the darkness, the shadows seemed to stretch, merging with the cold. The walls held the day's pain like a frozen echo. Outside, snow continued to fall in thick blankets, burying the compound in a deceptive softness. The wind howled across the yard, rattling windows and sneaking beneath doors. The cold seeped into everything: wood, metal, flesh. It crept into the prisoners' dreams, turning their nights into a frozen horror that mirrored their days. Some maruta huddled together in their cells, seeking warmth in shared proximity. Others curled into themselves, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. A few lay motionless, already succumbing to frostbite or hypothermia, even before their experiments began. The guards walked past their cells without emotion, marking the weak ones for early testing. Ishii visited the frostbite wing occasionally, inspecting the results personally. He walked through the rooms with calm interest, his eyes scanning the charts, the instruments, the bodies. He praised the scientists for their efficiency and urged them to push further, to discover the limits of the human body in winter conditions. His ambition remained as cold and unyielding as the season itself.
The winter of Unit 731 became a season without mercy, an unending cycle of freezing and thawing, suffering and silence. The frostbite experiments grew more elaborate. The hypothermia tests grew more extreme.
The maruta grew fewer in number, replaced steadily by new arrivals from the death trains. Yet the cold persisted. It wrapped its fingers around every life inside the compound. It crept into lungs, slowed heartbeats, dimmed eyes. It turned flesh to stone. It softened the line between life and death. Inside this winter hell, the lines blurred further each day, leaving only the stark rhythm of suffering. Unit 731 had transformed winter into a weapon, and the maruta, caught within its icy grasp, had nowhere left to hide from its reach. The winter that had turned Unit 731 into a frozen crucible of suffering began to thaw slowly as the months passed, but with the coming of spring came something even colder than Manchuria's bitter winds: fear. Not the fear that gripped the maruta as the experiments deepened, nor the fear that haunted the villagers outside the compound. This was a new kind of fear, one that crept into the minds of the soldiers, the scientists, and even into the cracks of Ishii Shiro's perfectly controlled world. War had begun to shift. Rumors seeped through the facility like drafts of icy air. Japan was no longer advancing. Battles once thought certain were becoming uncertain. And in the distance, powerful forces were beginning to stir, forces Ishii had hoped would remain far from Manchuria. The Soviet army, a relentless machine of men and steel, was drawing nearer with every passing month. Unit 731 did not halt its work as these whispers grew louder. The experiments continued with the same relentless cruelty: frostbite studies, vivisection, poison tests, plague releases. The maruta suffered without pause. But behind the scenes, something subtle began to fracture. The staff spoke with hushed tones, glancing nervously at one another. The guards, once rigid in their routines, tightened their patrols and checked the fences more often. The officers' meetings grew more frequent and more frantic. Files began to disappear from certain shelves. Scientists locked their notes in drawers, as though fearing that someone, not from outside, but from within, might seize them. The tension that until now had only flown from Ishii's ambition now had another source: desperation.
It was Ishii himself who felt the first cracks. He studied war reports each evening, reading them by the dim glow of a lamp in his office. Maps lay spread across the desk, corners weighed down with glass jars containing tissue samples from experiments long concluded. The news was impossible to ignore. The empire he believed unshakable was beginning to sway. Yet even as he grasped the shifting tide, Ishii refused to slow his research. If anything, he pushed harder. He demanded faster results, more tests, more drastic methods. The scientists, already frayed by months of brutal winter work, felt the weight of his orders pressing on their backs like a blade. They increased the pace, expanding the experiments to include larger groups of prisoners. Fresh maruta from the death trains were immediately used for high-risk tests: disease spreads, rapid frostbite exposures, high-pressure studies designed to simulate battlefield conditions. The facility grew louder with the hum of machinery, the rushing of air pumps, the clatter of metal tools. The cruelty that once felt like a cold, efficient routine now took on a frantic tone. It was as if the staff sensed time slipping from their grasp and were trying to extract as much data as possible before everything collapsed. The maruta felt this change too. Their treatment grew harsher, their food portions smaller, their movements more restricted. Guards patrolled the prison blocks with agitation, as though bracing for something unimaginable. Some maruta sensed that their suffering was entering a new, more dangerous phase. They tried to cling to any fragment of hope, but hope had never found a home inside the walls of Unit 731. Spring deepened into early summer, and the outside world began to encroach upon the compound. The sound of distant artillery tests, Japanese defensive drills, echoed across the plains.
Sometimes, faint vibrations shook the laboratory equipment. Guards flinched at these tremors, quick to glance toward the horizon. The villagers, too, felt the tension spreading like an invisible storm. They noticed more patrols, more checkpoints, more secrecy. The death trains still arrived, but their cargo grew thinner, as if even the Empire's reaches were dwindling. Inside the compound, Ishii gathered his officers for frequent strategic meetings. Behind closed doors, he spoke of a future where Unit 731's research could turn the tide of the war. He scribbled ambitious plans across chalkboards: disease bombs, mass plague dispersal, biological assaults that could devastate entire armies. His eyes glittered with a fervor that unsettled even his most loyal subordinates. The Empire might be collapsing elsewhere, but here, Ishii still clung to his vision, with the desperation of a man drowning, yet unwilling to release the weight dragging him down.
But war does not wait for the dreams of men. The turning point came quietly. A report arrived from Tokyo, carried by a courier whose eyes betrayed exhaustion and dread. Japan was losing ground on multiple fronts. American bombers ravaged cities. Naval battles ended in devastation. The empire was shrinking. Territory after territory slipped away. And then came the news that struck Ishii's heart like ice. The Soviet Union was preparing for a massive offensive in Manchuria. Unit 731 was no longer a hidden sanctuary. It was now perched on the edge of a battlefield. The panic that followed was not immediate, but it grew quickly, like a fire smoldering beneath floorboards. Officers rushed between buildings, delivering new orders. Scientists locked their research journals away. Assistants packed laboratory equipment into crates. Guards doubled their shifts. Ishii summoned his closest advisors, outlining emergency protocols and evacuation plans. But while the staff scrambled, the maruta saw none of these preparations directly. Their world remained confined to their cells, where the air grew hotter and foul as summer advanced. But they felt the shift through smaller signs. The guards barked orders with unsteady voices. The scientists no longer lingered over their notes. Some experiments were abruptly halted mid-procedure. Others were rushed with careless urgency, leading to even more suffering. And then one morning, the crematorium emitted a plume of smoke so thick and dark it blotted out the sun. The villagers watched in horror as ash drifted across their fields, darker than ever before. Inside the compound, staff members worked frantically to burn documents, charts, reports, tissue samples, equipment logs. The very data Ishii had built his empire upon was now fuel for the fires he hoped would erase their crimes. This destruction only amplified the panic. If the scientists were willing to burn their life's work, something catastrophic was approaching. Rumors reached the maruta in whispers. Some prisoners overheard guards mentioning the Soviets. Others sensed that the staff moved with the urgency of people preparing for flight. Those who had survived for months clung to these fragments of information, desperate to understand whether help was coming or whether their suffering would intensify before the end. As the days passed, the movements within Unit 731 became chaotic. Crates were loaded onto trucks. Weapons were stockpiled. Generators were tested repeatedly. The air thickened with tension, carrying a metallic taste of fear.
Ishii paced the floors of his office, his mind racing. His grand plans of biological warfare seemed to unravel before him. Reports of international pressure, of captured Japanese officers revealing classified information, of American intelligence intercepting confidential communications, all converged into a threat he had never prepared for. Still, he clung to one belief,
that his research was too valuable to be lost. Not morally valuable, nor scientifically pure, but strategically vital. Valuable enough that someone, somewhere, would protect him if he could offer his data in return. And with that belief growing like a dark seed, Ishii made decisions that ensured Unit 731's final days would be its most horrifying. He ordered the complete destruction of all evidence. He ordered the execution of remaining prisoners. He ordered the laboratories to be dismantled and burned. He ordered the staff to flee the compound as soon as everything had been cleansed of traces. But before these orders could be fully carried out, the Soviet movements intensified. Trucks roared between buildings. Officers shouted commands with cracking voices. The distant rumble of heavy artillery grew louder each day, inching closer to Pingfang. At night, faint flashes appeared on the horizon, their light briefly illuminating the sky like silent lightning. The maruta felt the change in the atmosphere. Their guards grew more violent, more frantic. Their food rations dwindled to almost nothing. Some cells were left unmonitored for hours at a time. Others were opened suddenly, only for prisoners to be dragged away and never seen again. Inside this unraveling world, the winter hell of Unit 731 was replaced by a different kind of suffering. A suffocating dread, a frantic urgency, a fear that the end would be even worse than the beginning. The collapse of the empire had reached Pingfang. But Unit 731 would not go quietly. A final storm of fire, secrecy, and death was rising within its walls. And as the Soviets approached with unstoppable force, the darkest chapter of Ishii's monstrous creation prepared to reach its end.
The air inside Unit 731 grew thicker with every passing hour. Fear had settled over the compound like the final layer of ash from a dying fire, choking the breath of every man, woman, and child still trapped within its walls. The Soviets were coming. Their tanks had crushed through the borders of Manchuria. Their infantry flooded the land like an unstoppable tide. Every Japanese outpost within reach was falling one by one, and now the storm was moving straight toward Pingfang. The men who had once walked the corridors of Unit 731 with confidence now moved with frantic urgency. Their once pristine uniforms were wrinkled and stained. Sweat clung to their brows despite the cooling winds of early autumn. Papers rustled, crates slammed shut, boots thudded against concrete floors. In the span of a week, the carefully ordered world of Ishii Shiro had been reduced to chaos. The laboratories that once hummed with cold precision now rattled under the weight of hurried disassembly. Instruments were packed or smashed, glass containers shattered, tables overturned. Research notes, years of meticulously documented cruelty, were pulled from shelves and fed into incinerators that burned with ravenous flame. The thick smoke from these fires rose into the sky, forming dark spirals that mingled with the already polluted air above the compound. Outside, soldiers dug trenches and prepared barricades, though many of them suspected such defenses would amount to nothing. No one had illusions about the strength of the Soviet army. The officers barked commands nonetheless, clinging to routine even as the walls of their empire crumbled around them. Inside the prison blocks, the maruta felt the shift more acutely than anyone. The guards who once moved with calm brutality were now erratic, unpredictable. Some cell doors remained locked for days, the prisoners left in suffocating darkness without food or water. Others were opened suddenly, prisoners dragged into the corridors and marched toward the laboratories or the yard. Some never returned. The maruta who remained behind listened to distant gunshots, the sharp cracks punctuating the heavy silence like nails being hammered into a coffin. Then came the order that sealed their fate. Ishii Shiro, standing in the heart of the compound, surrounded by officers whose faces had gone pale from fear, commanded the liquidation of all prisoners. No maruta could be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. No witness could survive. No story could escape. He believed the empire's future, and his own, depended on the disappearance of every trace.
The execution process began immediately. Guards armed with rifles moved through the prison blocks, their boots splashing through puddles of water and blood on the cold concrete floor. Some prisoners were taken to the yard and shot quickly, their bodies left where they fell. Others were locked inside buildings that were then set aflame, smoke billowing into the air as flames consumed wood, steel, and flesh. The smell of burning began to saturate the compound, spreading with each gust of wind. Some maruta, sensing the end approaching, clung desperately to the hope that the chaos might grant them escape. They pressed themselves against cell doors, listening for moments when guards were distracted. But Unit 731 was a fortress even in its collapse. The maruta had no way out. They were trapped within the nightmare that had shaped their suffering from the moment they arrived. Meanwhile, Ishii's officers scrambled to gather essential personnel for evacuation. Trucks rumbled through the compound carrying crates of equipment deemed too valuable to destroy. These crates contained not tools, but data. Results of experiments, formulas, charts, diagrams showing the efficiency of plague bombs, the spread of cholera, the progression of frostbite. Ishii considered these his greatest achievements. Even if the empire fell, he believed these documents would secure his future. As the days passed, the rumble of Soviet artillery grew louder, echoing across the plains. The staff of Unit 731 grew increasingly frantic. Soldiers abandoned their posts, assistants fled their stations. The once rigid hierarchy dissolved into a frenzy of self-preservation. But Ishii remained composed, or at least he pretended to be. Beneath his controlled demeanor, his mind raced with thoughts of escape, cover, and survival. He had spent years constructing an empire of suffering. Now he needed to dismantle it without leaving any trail that could lead back to him. He devised his plan carefully. The staff would evacuate south, blending into the retreating Japanese forces. The laboratories would be destroyed entirely, burned, flooded, collapsed. Every maruta would be killed, and Ishii would vanish into the fog of war, taking his data with him. The destruction of the compound began in earnest days before the Soviets reached Pingfang. Explosives were placed in key buildings, furnaces ran non-stop, incinerators burned without pause. Thick clouds of black smoke smothered the compound, turning sunlight into a dull red smear in the sky.
The disease wing was the first to be dismantled. Assistants smashed glass containers, splashing cultures of plague and cholera onto the floors. Insects used for experiments were burned in heaps. Flasks were shattered, cabinets emptied, ventilation systems dismantled. The scientists worked feverishly, their gloves slick with residue. Some became infected in the process, collapsing amid their workstations. Their bodies were dragged away and added to the fires. Next came the frostbite wing. Instruments were thrown into piles and set ablaze. The cold chambers, once filled with ice and screams, were left to collapse under detonations that shook the facility. Metal pipes burst, spraying water that hissed and steamed upon hitting the flames. The vivisection buildings underwent a similar fate. Tables were overturned, tools scattered, shelves of preserved organs smashed. And when everything had been destroyed, soldiers placed charges along the floor and walls, ensuring that not a single piece of evidence would remain. In the prison blocks, the last remaining maruta were gathered and led outside. Their bodies trembled with hunger, illness, and fear. Some were too weak to stand and were carried by guards who had grown numb to the weight of death. The prisoners were marched toward a trench dug near the perimeter of the compound. The guards lined them up, raising their rifles as the prisoners stared blankly at the sky, their breath forming faint wisps in the air. Gunfire cracked. The maruta fell. Silence followed. When it was done, the bodies were pushed into the trench. Dirt was shoveled over them hastily. The ground swallowed the remains of hundreds of lives, their suffering buried beneath the earth that had borne witness to their torment. As the executions concluded, Ishii prepared to flee. He gathered his closest staff members, loaded his trucks with data, and issued final orders to destroy what remained. Officers moved through the compound, lighting fires, detonating explosives, and flooding the lower levels. The once mighty fortress of Unit 731 began to crumble, its walls collapsing inward, its floors buckling, its structures collapsing into heaps of twisted metal and charred wood. The sky turned black with smoke. Then, in the early hours of morning, Ishii and his selected staff left the ruins of Unit 731 behind. Their convoy sped south, blending into the chaos of retreating Japanese forces. Ishii did not look back. His mind was already shifting toward the next step: how to ensure his immunity, how to use his research as leverage, how to transform his crimes into currency.
Meanwhile, the Soviet army closed in. By the time their soldiers reached Pingfang, the facility was a wasteland of ash and rubble. The fires still smoldered. The gates lay twisted on the ground. The air hung heavy with the stench of burning. The Soviets moved cautiously through the ruins, sensing the horror that had once thrived here, but not yet aware of its magnitude. They found remnants of experiments, fragments that the flames had not fully consumed, scattered notes, broken jars, charred instruments. They discovered rooms that still carried the smell of blood. They found bones half buried in trenches, pieces of clothing, personal items abandoned by the fleeing staff. Slowly, the truth of Unit 731 began to reveal itself, not through words, but through the haunting remnants of suffering left behind. But Ishii was already far away by then. He reached Japan with his surviving staff and immediately began negotiations with American officials. He offered data he claimed could save American lives in future wars, data on frostbite, disease, hypothermia, toxins. Data obtained through the torture and death of thousands. The Americans listened. And then, in a decision that would stain history forever, they accepted Ishii's bargain. They granted him immunity. In exchange for the results of his experiments, they shielded him and his top scientists from prosecution. They buried Unit 731's crimes beneath layers of secrecy and geopolitical strategy. The victims were forgotten, the survivors silenced, the truth hidden. Ishii lived the rest of his days in comfort, death never touching him as it had touched so many inside the walls of Unit 731. The Soviets continued their investigations, uncovering what they could, but the deal had already been struck. The architect of Unit 731 had escaped judgment. The facility was gone. The prisoners were dead. The empire had collapsed. But the shadows of Unit 731 would not fade. They would linger, haunting memories of human cruelty, of suffering carved into the frozen soil of Pingfang, of atrocities preserved not in justice, but in secrecy. The world would learn the truth only decades later, but the ghosts of Unit 731 had never left.
For years after the fires of Unit 731 died out and the debris of Pingfang settled under layers of dust and weeds, the land seemed to hold its breath. The compound was gone, its walls shattered, its corridors open to the sky, yet something in the air remained heavy.
Birds circled high but seldom landed. The wind passed through, but the place never quite felt clean, as though the soil itself remembered. After the war ended and the empire that had once cast its shadow across Asia fell, life staggered forward in broken steps. Cities rebuilt, flags changed, governments rose from the ruins of the old. For millions, survival meant looking ahead, not back. But in Manchuria and far beyond it, there were those who could not forget. Not because they wished to cling to the past, but because the past had embedded itself in their bones like fragments of glass. Some of them were villagers from places like Pingfang. They returned to fields left fallow, to homes stripped bare by soldiers, to roads that no longer led where they used to. They walked past the ghost of Unit 731's perimeter, where only twisted wire, broken stones, and scattered debris remained. Tall grasses grew where guard towers once stood. Cracked concrete, half swallowed by dirt, marked the outlines of buildings that had housed laboratories and prison blocks. Children born after the war played there, unaware at first of what lay beneath their feet. But the elders knew. They remembered the death trains, the smoke that stained the sky, the screams that rode the wind in winter. They had no documents, no photographs, no official confirmation. They had only memories, rough-edged and incomplete, but sharp enough to cut. At night, around weak fires and patched houses, they told one another what they had seen. How ash had fallen like gray snow. How certain families had vanished overnight. How soldiers had warned them never to speak of the facility. For years, that warning echoed in their minds. Far from the ruined compound, a smaller, quieter struggle unfolded inside the hearts of those who had once worked in Unit 731. Some scientists returned to universities and hospitals under new names or new titles. They put on clean white coats, wrote research papers, treated patients, and walked through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and hope instead of rot and fear. Yet no amount of fresh paint or polite conversation could fully erase the sights they had witnessed or what they had done with their own hands.
Some of them buried their memories so deep that even their families never knew. They avoided conversations about the war. They flinched at certain sounds, a metal tray clinking, a distant train whistle, a door slamming. A few woke in the middle of the night, hearts pounding, drenched in sweat, images of vivisection tables and frostbitten limbs surging back with brutal clarity. They would lie on the dark, listening to their own breathing, reminding themselves that the war was over, that Unit 731 no longer existed. But in those moments of sleeplessness, they knew the facility still lived inside them. Others felt no such torment. They carried their past with a chilling calm, rationalizing their participation as obedience to orders, a necessary sacrifice, or a contribution to science. Some even boasted quietly, in select circles, about the unique data they had acquired during the war. They spoke not of maruta, not of suffering, but of results, correlations, and the advancement of knowledge. Behind their detached language lay the unspoken truth that no one challenged, because so few knew enough to do so. In another part of the world, within government offices lined with file cabinets and guarded by secrecy, the story of Unit 731 was being transformed from history into bargaining chip. Documents crossed desks, meetings were held behind closed doors. The men in these rooms wore suits instead of uniforms, but they shared one trait with Ishii. They saw the world in terms of advantage. The data collected from Unit 731, data soaked in blood, was seen not as a record of atrocity, but as material with potential strategic value. Immunity was granted. Trials were avoided. Files were buried in archives stamped with classified seals. The atrocities that had taken place in Pingfang were folded into the shadows of post-war politics, too inconvenient to confront, too useful to discard. Yet shadows are not perfect veils. They leak. The Soviets, who had reached the ruins of Unit 731 before most of the world even knew its name, conducted their own investigations. They walked through what remained of the compound, lifting charred beams, sifting through ashes, finding bone fragments and melted glass. They interviewed villagers, collected scattered pages overlooked by the fleeing staff, pieced together fragments of what had happened there. Their reports hinted at something vast, something monstrous. But the world, still reeling from the revelations of other camps and other horrors, could not fully grasp another layer of cruelty. In distant villages, people who had survived disease outbreaks during the war remembered the strange planes that had flown overhead, the bombs that had shattered but not exploded like normal shells, the rats that had appeared in unusual numbers, the way illness had spread afterward like a curse. They told their stories to anyone who would listen. For years, very few did. Time moved on. Graves were dug. Children grew into adults. Countries signed treaties and built monuments. But the victims of Unit 731 remained largely unnamed, uncounted, unheard.
Among them were survivors, rare, scattered individuals who had passed through the edges of the facility and somehow lived. A prisoner transferred before his scheduled experiment. A villager infected but not killed by a test outbreak. A worker within the compound who had seen enough to understand but not enough to die. These people carried memories like scars no one else could see. Many chose silence at first. Fear still lingered, a ghost of the old warnings. But as decades passed, as the world changed and the certainty of their own mortality grew, some found their voices. They spoke of cold rooms and numbered tags, of doctors whose eyes were empty, of screams that never seemed to stop. Their testimonies were often fragmented, their timelines blurred by trauma and time. But together they formed a picture of a place that had long been smothered under ashes and secrecy. At first, they were dismissed by some as exaggerators or confused relics of a bygone era. But slowly other pieces began to surface. Documents declassified, photographs studied, testimonies cross-checked. Historians, journalists, and researchers began to pull at the frayed threads surrounding Unit 731, unraveling the silence that had protected its creators. In Pingfang itself, the land changed yet again. Where barracks once stood, new structures rose. Roads extended in new directions. Fields were cultivated. Yet remnants of the old compound remained if one knew where to look. A cracked foundation here, a rusted pipe there. Stories whispered between generations. Children caught rumors from their grandparents, piecing together fragments into half-understood legends of a place where people had been taken and never returned. A museum would eventually stand there, but for a long time the memorial to Unit 731 existed only in memory and quiet conversations. Memory is stubborn. It adheres to places and people, resurfacing when least expected. A chill in the air on a still day, a train passing at night, the smell of smoke. For those who had lived in the shadow of Unit 731, these small triggers brought back images that no passage of years could erase. There is another way shadows live on.
through what is not done, not said, not admitted. In courtrooms in other countries, men were tried and condemned for war crimes. Maims became symbols of evil. Records were displayed. Monuments were built. Yet Ishii Shiro and many of his colleagues never faced a judge. They faded into ordinary lives, their names omitted from the stories most people learned in school. This absence formed a different kind of wound. It was not only the horror of what had been done, but the horror of what had not been acknowledged.
For the descendants of victims, this silence was its own kind of prison. They inherited questions without answers, grief without official recognition, trauma without public witness. Some grew up hearing vague references to relatives who had not returned after the war, or disappeared near a Japanese camp. Only later did they realize that the place in question had a name: Unit 731. As the 20th century drew closer to its end, more evidence emerged and more voices rose. Journalists uncovered testimonies. Scholars published studies. Former staff members, older now, and perhaps unnerved by their own nearing deaths, spoke in cautious fragments about what they had done. The picture grew sharper, darker, and impossible to ignore. Visitors eventually came to Pingfang, not as soldiers or prisoners, but as travelers, historians, families searching for traces of someone lost. They walked along paths where mud sometimes still revealed shards of glass and metal. They stood before displays of rusted instruments and faded photographs, trying to comprehend how a place so ordinary in shape, just buildings, pipes, corridors, could have contained so much suffering. Some left in tears, others in silence. A few left with a new, unsettling understanding of how far human beings could go when ambition, obedience, and ideology stripped away empathy. The shadows of Unit 731 did not remain trapped in the past. They slipped quietly into the present, in every debate about ethics and science, in every question about how far a government should go in the name of security, in every story of atrocities hidden or excused because the information gained was deemed useful. Whenever someone argued that the end justifies the means, the ghosts of Pingfang stirred. They stirred when data from cruel experiments was cited as valuable. They stirred when victims were told their suffering could not be fully acknowledged because it was inconvenient. They stirred whenever people chose to look away from the darker corners of history. The land where Unit 731 once stood now wears a different face. Time has covered many of its scars. Grass grows where trenches were dug. Trees cast shadows where guard towers once did. Laughter can sometimes be heard, children running past, their feet pattering over ground that was once soaked in fear. Yet beneath that everyday life lies a layer of memory that does not dissolve. It waits in the soil. It waits in the stories of the old. It waits in the documents still being examined, the survivors still being heard, the questions still being asked. The horrors of Unit 731 were not fantasy, not stories invented to frighten or entertain. They were real, lived by thousands, buried by politics, exhumed by memory. And the most chilling truth is not only what happened there, but how close it came to disappearing into silence forever. Shadows that are not confronted grow longer.
In the end, the legacy of Unit 731 is not only a record of unimaginable cruelty, but a warning carved into history that science without morality becomes a blade, that obedience without conscience becomes a weapon, that forgetting is a kind of complicity. The buildings of Unit 731 have fallen. The empire that created it has vanished, but the shadows still live,
in the stories that survivors whisper, in the questions that historians ask, and in the quiet realization that such darkness is not confined to one time or one place. It waits wherever people begin to believe that other human beings are less than human, and it remains silently, insisting that we remember.